Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the December 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Take Back the Land, Gentrification, and the Umoja Village Shantytown by Max Rameau, published by Nia Press. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this text is the third entry in the Homeless Industrial Complex video playlist. HIC is a syllabus and pack of readings that was put together and is available at bit.ly/carceral housing, CARCERAL housing. I'll put a link to that in the description, probably also in a pinned comment. Also, this is not the full work, Take Back the Land, just excerpts. Let's begin. Preface. On October 23, 2006, at approximately 3 p.m., a coalition of activists, local residents, and homeless individuals liberated a vacant lot on the corner of 62nd Street and Northwest 17th Ave in the Liberty City section of Miami. Over the course of 6 months, up to 53 people at one time, and over 150 people in total, were housed and fed in an urban shantytown situated in the United States. For 6 months, formerly homeless people not only found a place to sleep, but a place to call home. They voted on the rules of the community in which they lived and partook in its development and maintenance, cooking, cleaning, building shanties, a shower, a library, and a welcome center. Some used the physical safety and food security to gather their thoughts and save money before moving up and on to an apartment or other living arrangements. Several residents became clean, returned to school, or found employment while living on the land. Neighbors of the village first gawked, then donated goods from their own meager belongings, volunteered their time, and even broke bread and ate with the residents. Supporters from across the state and beyond came to visit, help, and show solidarity. Students volunteered in droves, reigniting a level of student activism not seen in decades. A sense of ownership and community, call it self-determination, organized a segment of the population widely considered unorganizable. Virtually all who lived there or visited will attest the Umoja Village Shantytown was something special. Umoja Village was part living protest, part street theater, and part solution to the problem. It was part militant, part loving. It was simultaneously the most and the least radical response to a disturbing crisis. It was history, yet the Umoja Village was but a continuation of previous historic acts and trends. Only April 26, 2007, just 3 days after celebrating its 6-month anniversary, during which an ambitious program to consolidate living arrangements on the land and attack the vestiges of gentrification were announced, the Umoja Village burned to the ground when a fire started under circumstances which can only be described as suspect. While the physical structures burned and fell, the sense of community and empowerment that we built can never be destroyed. Umoja, the Swahili word for unity, will rise again. While land struggles are generally considered the domain of the Third World, devolving material conditions in the United States compel social scientists to examine this strategy for its use in the, quote, First World. This book, then, is part history of the Umoja Village and part political theory around land struggle and other campaigns which strike at the heart of the power relationship between the poverty of working-class African people and the opulence of the wealthiest society in the history of planet Earth. Hopefully, some of the insights gained, the hard way, will make the road forward clear for those coming to finish the job. Chapter 1. The Morning After. A splash of sun woke me, and for a brief moment I was disoriented, wondering why I was in my car at the break of day. I sat up, peered out of the car window, and achieved instant and total recall. To my left were the telephone poles donated 3 months ago. Most were used to frame our garden beds, but last night the remainder were used as bedding for those who remained to defend the land. Some bodies stretched, preparing to face the day, while others hid under blankets, evading reality, prolonging the inevitable. News trucks were everywhere, with a few reporters pacing to and fro, awaiting their live shots. Mostly, though, there were the charred remains of a devastating fire. The soot Charcoal and ash was punctured by the occasional bright-colored shirt or other item that managed to escape the flames. Continuously, smoke rose from the earth, from the smoldering remains of shanties, clothing, papers, food, and furniture. I surveyed the damage from the edge of the burnt section of the lot and thought, this looks like a disaster. It was not until weeks later, looking at photographs and video of the same scene, did I realize that it was not like a disaster, it was an actual disaster. I checked in with Bernadette, my partner, and we sketched out a plan for the day. Before hanging up, she handed the phone to our son so I could wish him a happy birthday. The Umoja village Shantytown burned to the ground on Akinle's first birthday, April 26, 2007. After greeting our residents and supporters, I organized the setup of new living spaces, the preparation and distribution of breakfast, and tried to jumpstart the rebuilding process. News trucks from virtually every local station were parked on the land, poking around, doing live shots, and conducting interviews. The residents laughed at our new skyline, courtesy of the media outlets. We joked about hurling our raw food up in the air and having it fall to our plates as fully cooked meals, thanks to the power of the microwave antennas rising from the trucks. Shortly after 10 a.m., the Miami city manager, Pete Hernandez, arrived. After reiterating that our primary desire was for the city to refrain from raiding us, we provided him with a brief list of our needs, including portable toilets to replace those that melted in the fire. Chapter 5. Land and Gentrification. The Umoja village Shantytown received its share of press, mostly focused on the embarrassment it caused to Miami-Dade County and the city of Miami. Attention was also appropriately lavished on the nexus between gentrification, the housing crisis, the role of the government in manufacturing that crisis, and the number of people homeless, both street and underhoused, in South Florida. While all of that's well and good, such coverage expended a disproportionate amount of attention on the tip of the iceberg, visible above the water, and not nearly enough attention on the humongous glacier lurking below the surface. The tendency is understandable, as the current events type of news generally covers what's happening, leaving the more significant questions, such as why is this happening, to other genres, such as history and academia. I will refrain from calculating the impact of conflicts of interest on the corporate media. News coverage of what is sufficient for most, but anyone studying, much less engaged in, liberation struggles must search deeper and come to understand the why. Only by struggling with the why can we understand the significance and context of the what and determine appropriate responses or courses of action. Surface versus root issues. In order to properly analyze any social dilemma or contradiction, it is critical to distinguish between the surface issues at play and the root issues at stake. Surface issues are those which directly and tangibly confront the society and its members, those issues on the surface, to the forefront, and in our face. Surface issues often grab attention, mobilize people, and reveal the existence and importance of a deeper problem. The surface issue, however compelling, is only the manifestation or symptom of the deeper, more significant problem, the fundamental or root issue. Conversely, the root issue is the cause of the surface issue. This distinction is important to make because no matter how vigorously one attacks a symptom, the only way to solve a problem is by resolving its cause, not its symptom. This is not to say that surface issues or symptoms should be ignored, but that we understand that addressing the symptom is no substitute for addressing the root cause. For example, a dinner party patron who develops a runny nose would do well to acquire napkins and wipe as often as necessary. At the same time, it must be understood that while the runny nose is problematic, it's not the actual problem, but rather the untimely symptom of a deeper problem and sickness. While our patron cannot be expected to enjoy the soiree by ignoring the constant nasal drip, it must be clear that the napkin is not curing the sickness, it is merely masking its symptoms from the other dinner guests. If the root cause of the problem is never addressed, one could, conceivably, spend their entire life wiping, dabbing, flowing, and otherwise dealing with a symptom which would disappear on its own only if the underlying sickness, the root issue, were addressed. The perils of failing to distinguish between a symptom and the problem which causes the symptom, the surface issue versus the root issue, is not limited to those with active social calendars. It continues to confuse and confound liberation and social justice movements. The failure to understand the difference between surface and root issues will convince us that we're making progress when we are making none, that we are moving forward when we're running around in circles, and that we've solved a problem when in fact we're only altering the manifestation of that problem. Consequently, the crisis of gentrification and low-income housing mandates a thorough examination and analysis of the surface and root issues at stake. As bad as it is, this crisis, at least as it relates to the black community, is a surface issue, a mere symptom of a deeper problem. The crisis touches our lives as we see and feel the impact of law, government expenditures, and the mobilization of private capital. Gentrification forces us out of our communities, and the lack of low-income housing offers us few options, and yet gentrification is clearly a surface, not a root issue. This is no attempt to minimize the importance of gentrification as an economic phenomenon and social issue. Quite to the contrary, gentrification and our response to it will likely emerge as a defining issue of this generation. Gentrification destroys homes, separates families, and guts historically black communities to make room for whites looking for shorter commutes to work and the arts. In many ways, gentrification in the 2000s is the functional equivalent of segregation in the 1950s and 60s. Social movements were built around fighting segregation, as students and other sectors of society risked life and limb to fight for its demise. And yet, a proper analysis of history and struggle affirms that segregation was and remains a surface issue, not a root issue. Because the surface issue of segregation was elevated in the minds of many to the status of root issue, it was presumed that the end of segregation, as a set of laws, would end the problem of inequality codified by those laws. More than 50 years after the legal walls of segregation began to crumble, the races in the U.S. are still largely separated, if not outright segregated. Most blacks live in overwhelmingly black communities, and most whites live in overwhelmingly white communities. Thanks to the defeat of legal segregation, a noble cause which was right to fight, blacks can now sit next to whites in restaurants, on the bus, and even in the stall of the public bathroom, before each returns to their respective racially separate neighborhoods and houses of worship. Poverty and unemployment in the black community remains disproportionate to that suffered by whites, and discrimination remains rampant, even if technically illegal. Of course, the powers that be, particularly through the use of the media, cultural outlets, and the educational system, had an interest in advancing the notion that a root issue had been resolved, and therefore the society was just and the need for struggle ended. As a result, many in the social justice movement were thoroughly confused and confounded by how segregation was defeated, but racism and inequality persisted. If segregation were in fact a root issue, or a cause, then the elimination of the Jim Crow laws would end the problems of racism and inequality. But racism and inequality did not end with the fall of Jim Crow because segregation was not the cause of racism and inequality. It was a symptom. Jim Crow laws were the manifestation of the hate whites bore against blacks and the specific rules of white supremacy and privilege. But the root issue never was eating in a specific restaurant or drinking water from a particular fountain. The root issue was not segregation. It was white supremacy and power. Consequently, 50 years after the fall of legal segregation, widespread de facto segregation persists. The black community faces many of the same challenges it did then, and whites continue to derive privilege from their whiteness. Just as the best way to stop a runny nose is not to wipe, but to cure the sickness which causes it, the best way to stop segregation is not to end the laws, but to end the ideology which spurred its existence in the first place. As an aside, people differ on what qualifies as a root issue for them. While most fought segregation as a means of addressing the root issue of discrimination and inequality, some people fought segregation because they wanted to live next to white people or eat in fancy restaurants. The U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice was told of how, in segregated Alabama, white store owners allowed her mother to shop at their businesses, albeit after hours, even while excluding the general black population. To Rice's family, the root issue was literally segregation, their right to buy from racist store owners with access to cute outfits. And to people like Rice, the struggle is over, as she can now shop, dine, and live where she wants. For others, however, there are deeper principles at stake, and we continue to fight until those principles are realized. The same model and pattern applies to the fight against gentrification. Under segregation, the larger white community ordered blacks to live in this area, and we were compelled to comply. At the end of legal segregation, most stayed in the black community while others thought they were leaving, but ultimately succeeded only in convincing white people to move out of their neighborhood to make room for a new black community. Today, under gentrification, some in the white community want to move back into historically black communities, forcing blacks to vacate and make room for them, and we are again compelled to comply. What is the objective difference, in the context of our human rights and political power, between the 1950s and the early 2000s? In both instances, rich whites make money off the backs of poor blacks. The government is used to enforce the geopolitical objectives of the larger white community, particularly the wealthier whites who covet the inexpensive and strategically situated black neighborhood, and black families have little real power to determine on their own where they will live. In segregation, we were forced into one area, and in gentrification, we were forced out of one area. What is the objective difference between the 1950s and today? We repeat history because during the civil rights movement, we fought the symptom of the problem, not the actual problem. Consequently, just like the party patron who wipes one runny nostril only to get that drippy feeling from the other, our failure to deal with the root issues, not the segregation laws, but the reason why those laws were enacted in the first place, is coming back to haunt us. The root issue then was not segregation, and the root issue now is not gentrification. The root issue is land. Not just land in the physical sense of the word, although that is included, but land in the political sense of the word, meaning power and control over land. Land is an essential element of liberation, an absolute prerequisite. The lack of power and control over land condemns the majority of African, black people in America to an endless cycle of moving from one undesirable lot to the next, at the behest and for the benefit of the rich. This reality demonstrates how differentiating between surface and root issues brings clarity to our analysis and enables us to gauge progress, or the lack thereof. Those who believe that segregation itself was root or fundamental argue forcefully that the struggle is, for all intents and purposes, over. However, those who understand land as root and segregation as symptomatic recognize just how little progress has been made. The same segments of society which confined us to one geographical area then are able to, with relative ease, force us off of those same geographical areas 50 years later. They're able to do so precisely because, in relation to control over land, the black community has no more power today than we had prior to the civil rights movement. It's easy to see that while much movement has occurred, little tangible progress has been made in dealing with the root issue of power and control over land. To be thorough and fair, it's often argued that there are really two root causes at stake here, both land and racism or white supremacy, and that ending the root issue of white supremacy would have also ended segregation. While that might be true, the reality is that ending white supremacy and hate in someone else is neither easy nor a substitute for building power for oneself. As such, even if we were willing and able to devote our entire existence and resources towards the task of teaching whites to hate us less, after the successful completion of the mission, we would still have before us the task of building power and control over land. Therefore, the issue of land, more specifically power and collective control over land, is root and primary. Those who benefit from our misery, of course, would rather that we only address the surface issues, and then give up the struggle after making progress on that front. Our mission and objectives must be more substantial, however. Sickness cannot be cured by wiping a runny nose, and liberation cannot be achieved by setting our sights on superficial changes which do not address the root causes of exploitation and oppression. For these reasons and others, it's clear that in order to address the crisis of gentrification and low-income housing in a real way, our responses must be rooted in land-based solutions. The work of Take Back the Land is not fundamentally about the homeless or even gentrification. It is fundamentally about the collective control over land. Chapter 7. The Adversarial Takeover of Land. Even more important than the logistical plans for taking land and building the Shantytown were the ideological and political underpinnings guiding the decision. Due to the broad nature of the strategic partnership, planning, and implementing the action, the political framing for the action was equally as broad. One of the most powerful aspects of the action was that inside of that broad framework, each individual and group was free to bring their own priorities and ideology, and each set of ideas carried as much value and legitimacy in relationship to the action as the others. So, while some of us approached the land takeover as a function of Pan-Africanism in one of its diasporic manifestations, others saw it as the fulfillment of a particular form of nationalism, while others considered it part of the movement to prioritize the earth, reestablishing the relationship between people and the land. Each view contained value and significance, and for our purposes, no single perspective dominated over another. Every coalition demands some level of political unity, and for the purposes of building the Shantytown, we more than achieved the requisite standards. It should be made clear that while the level of unity we achieved proved ideal for this strategic partnership, it's not necessarily sufficient for other formations, including political organizations and certain types of coalitions. Under other circumstances, more rigorous levels of political unity must be achieved prior to moving on such a substantial initiative. For better or for worse, the problems associated with lacking political unity are rarely evident when an action fails. They're instead revealed after achieving a certain level of success, when participants must determine the next logical steps, and it's during those next steps that dormant issues often come to life. For example, in the 1950s and 60s, opposing Jim Crow and segregation provided sufficient unity for organizations and individuals to participate in the civil rights movement. However, only upon achieving certain levels of success, specifically ending legal segregation, did the lack of deeper political and ideological unity emerge as a significant factor. After the fall of Jim Crow laws, some believed their mission was accomplished and disconnected from the broader social justice movement. Others shifted focus towards maximizing gains for the black middle class through municipal and other middle management jobs. Others pursued the end of the economic Jim Crow, which gave teeth to the political system of discrimination. Still others considered the fall of Jim Crow a prerequisite in the multi-stepped march towards African liberation. The strategic partnership built by Take Back the Land, on the other hand, worked because we achieved the level of political unity required for the action. The political leadership was clearly identified and respected, and their strategic partners were given space to do their work, without unnecessary and unneeded demonstration of, quote, leadership. Principles of unity. The ideas which bound a loose band of activists from a broad range of backgrounds and ideologies formed the framework upon which political unity was built. We agreed on a core set of axioms or principles of unity, including 1. There is a crisis of gentrification in housing. 2. Housing, food, and living in dignity are human rights. 3. The root of the crisis is greed, and as long as profits were prioritized over people, and the exploitation of people and natural resources was a primary means of generating profit, the crisis would continue. 4. Development is about people, not buildings or profits. 5. The solution to the problem is community control over land. Each community must determine the best use of their own land. 6. The black community must control land in the black community. 7. We have a collective right to the land and an obligation as stewards of the land. 8. The government is part of the problem, and therefore we cannot depend on them to be part of the solution. 9. People must control their own lives. Self-determination is an integral part of liberation. While race was not a major part of the axioms, there was plenty of room inside of those principles for individuals to advance their own hard race-based line. In the same way, there was space for a hard environmentalist line, as well as lines in which economic analysis was primary. Another important concept not explicitly listed was the idea that even as we took control over land, it did not belong to us. It belonged to the indigenous people of this continent, those commonly called Indians. Many, but not all of us, held that land stolen 500 years ago is still stolen land. Quick comment there. A lot of land was stolen a lot more recently than 500 years ago. I mean, you can go back to like 1492 or something like that, but the reality is a lot of that happened in the last 200 years or even less. Continuing. As such, we were honored to welcome Sheridan Murphy of the American Indian Movement, AIM, who blessed the land on behalf of its rightful owners. Again, while this arrangement functioned for this particular formation, in which there was a lot of trust among the actors and a clear project plan and objectives, it will not necessarily work in every scenario. Objective analysis of each situation will determine the best political formation, given the participants and the realities on the ground. Political objectives. We recognize the need to develop clear political objectives in order to accomplish two things. First, to establish in advance guiding principles by which we can solve unforeseen problems and make decisions about next steps. Political objectives provide commonly agreed upon goal lines toward which participants advanced. When forced to make big decisions or to regroup, the objectives gave us context and orientation around which we could regain our footing. Further, because we empowered participants to make a range of decisions, the established principles and objectives enabled individuals to make decisions by simply applying those principles and objectives to any given situation. Those decisions which advanced our objectives and remained inside of our principles were good ones. For example, if a government official dropped by unannounced to offer residents temporary shelter in exchange for quitting the land, anyone could easily apply our principles and objectives and reject that offer without having to check back with the group. The second benefit to developing clear political objectives lies in providing us and the community with a measuring stick through which we can evaluate successes and failures. Without predetermined objectives, one can easily make bad deals and then claim easy victories. The claims can only be made in the absence of objective, pre-existing standards by which to measure the deal or, quote, victory. Conversely, political objectives help us realize victory even when it feels like defeat. For example, dealing with 50 people, many with social, chemical, and/or mental health issues, is extremely challenging. 3 months into the project, the constant personality clashes and ongoing management issues might convince people that they're in the midst of a historic failure. However, the only objective way to evaluate the proximity to victory or defeat is by measuring the objective reality against the political objectives. In any event, 3 primary political objectives of the project were hammered out, with concepts or sub-objectives or strategies associated with each. The objectives are: 1. House and feed people; 2. Assert the right of the black community to control land in the black community; and 3. Build a new society. 1. House and feed people. At first blush, this objective appeared so rudimentary and obvious that we almost didn't include it at all. In one sense, we accomplished this objective on October 23, 2006, when we arrived on the lot and housed and fed several homeless people. On a deeper level, we continuously struggled to meet this objective and all of its implications each and every day. This objective is the lowest in terms of political content, easiest to measure, and one around which the greatest number of people could unify, including everyone who visited and contributed to the Umoja village. This fact is important because it enabled us to secure material support from people who we might not otherwise have coaxed into assisting us, people who might not have agreed with me personally or with some of our other objectives. While some commented on or did not fully understand our other objectives, virtually everyone believed in the human right to housing and food, and our human obligation to provide those needs to our sisters and brothers. There has been no better rallying point, particularly among those who did not understand our broader political objectives or those who did not embrace them. This objective also guided our decision-making on a practical level. As the number of residents began to swell, the challenges associated with feeding more than 40 people 3 times per day, 7 days a week, grew as well. It rapidly became clear that continued unsustainable growth threatened the entire project, presenting challenges of logistics, human relations, and security as provocateurs, obviously sent by our detractors, appeared from time to time. Personally knowing each of our residents and discussing the political context of the village was critical in terms of creating a sense of ownership, buy-in, and unity, a process which resulted in residents volunteering to maintain the village, as well as refraining from activities which could result in its destruction. Also, as we surpassed 40 residents, our food supplies would occasionally diminish. This reality on the micro level was useful in demonstrating to our residents the importance of protecting and behaving responsibly with our natural resources on the macro level. The decision to stop building was painful and difficult, especially for those who slept on the couch waiting for the next shanties to be built. But given our objectives, the correct decision was obvious, even if difficult. In order to house and feed those we currently supported, we had to limit our growth, at least until our resources grew, or until we liberated more land. In a broader sense, we have an obligation to house and feed our sisters and brothers. The fact that the government is unable or unwilling to coordinate and facilitate that process does not alleviate us of our responsibility. In fact, quite the opposite. It heightens our responsibility because the social contract engineered to meet those obligations is breached. We were meeting our obligations to our people. 2. Assert the right of the black community to control land in the black community. The higher political objective, and the one which Take Back the Land is most closely associated, is the assertion that the land in the black community belongs to the black community, and therefore must be controlled by the black community. Inherent in this assertion is a recognition of two realities. First, we do not control the land in the neighborhoods in which we live. The powers that be, either in the form of wealthy developers or the government which advances the interests of those same wealthy developers, controls the land in our community. Overwhelmingly, those wealthy interests are non-black people, controlling the land in black communities. Further, those dual powers conspire to maintain control over our land so that they can continue to reap the benefits, invariably at our expense. The second inherent reality in the assertion is that in spite of the exploitation and oppression which denies us control over the land, it is ultimately our own responsibility to gain that control as a means of solving the problems plaguing us. If wealthy interests, and the government which works for them, want to profit from our resources, no amount of begging, marching, singing, or appeals to moral conscience will convince them to give up their profits so that oppressed people might benefit. If they were so inclined, they probably wouldn't be oppressing us so much in the first place. Whoever is the cause of the problem, we are responsible for the solution, and we must behave as such. This assertion and objective is at the heart of the land question. Land in our community is routinely taken and used for the benefit of members of other communities, the standard operating procedure in colonial-type relationships, and black communities in the U.S. are essentially domestic colonies, serving as centers for low-wage labor and a market for cheap goods. In the midst of a crisis of gentrification and low-income housing, wealthy, politically connected developers were getting land in the black community at fire sale prices, and often for free. The land giveaway allowed the developers to maximize their own profits, while deepening the ongoing crisis of gentrification and housing in the black community. The solution to this problem cannot be found in the halls of power which sanction and facilitate the exploitative relationship in the first place. The solution to the problem lies in the black community exercising control over the land, politics, and economy of our communities. By a collective control over land, as opposed to individual ownership of land, communities can make decisions about land use which benefit the community itself, not individual land or business owners whose pursuit of profit is a stronger pull than the commitment to broader social justice imperatives. Because key players in municipal governments, and in the federal government as well, are bankrolled in one form or another by major financial interests, and because those elected into office overwhelmingly share the same class interests as those same financial interests, local governments work for big money, not the average person. Miami provides the perfect example. Mayor Manny Diaz's election campaigns are bankrolled by big developers. Comment here, we did in a live stream a while ago a breakdown of the industries funding the Democratic and Republican parties, and real estate developers I think are number 4 or number 5 in both parties. So Diaz himself is a developer. When he thinks about an issue, he not only thinks about it as a developer because he is one, but thinks about it in terms of the interests of developers because they're the ones to whom he is politically beholden. The same is so of his lackey on the Miami Commission, Michelle Spence Jones. Her election campaign financing is derived almost exclusively from the Diaz political machine. When deciding how to vote, she must first consider the will of those who put her in power, Manny Diaz and his developer friends. The same applies to Miami-Dade Commissioner and notorious sellout Doran Raleigh. The land, then, in the black community is largely controlled by one of two forces, either wealthy developers and landlords who buy cheap property and maintain slum conditions as part of their business model, or by local governments who operate on behalf of the interests of the wealthy developers. In the final analysis, developers have money, own land, and employ government officials to fight for their interests. The black community has little money, even less land, and few fighting for its interests. What we do have, however, is our labor. In this context, labor is not limited to what we sell to business owners in exchange for an hourly wage, but includes our ability to take the streets in a fight for our rights. In addition, the collective control over land invokes the concept of self-determination in the political sense. The black community must develop a collective vision and muster the collective will and power to realize that vision. Because it does not exist in reality, the invoked concept of self-determination is a central part of the third objective. 3. Build a new society. The idea of building a new society is so simple, it's profound. On any other corner, poor, black, homeless people, particularly women, are on the margins of society's margins. They have no political power, their opinions do not matter, and more effort is exerted by the state to dislocate or hide them than to assist them. As we engaged in discussions about the concept of organizing the homeless, time and again we were told that they qualify as the most difficult group to organize. Some are not in full control of their faculties for one reason or another, and suffer under the dual scourge of mental illness and hardcore drug addiction. And yet, we assert that the most marginal members of society are better qualified to run their city or village than the college education elected official and bureaucrat. We not only asserted the proposition, we proved it as Umoja's residents made real decisions about the rules of the village and the manner in which it was run. In this new society, people not only related differently to the land itself, they related differently to one another, and ultimately to power. They had all of it while on the land. Residents literally interacted differently with each other while on the land than while off, even just a few blocks away. While it was difficult to completely negate the years of conditioning imposed on people from the broader society, the idea that we were building something new and different captured the imagination of our residents and supporters in a real and lasting way. In this new society, human beings are valued over and above material things, creature comforts, and even profit. Chapter 10. Everything you wanted to know about building a shantytown but didn't know where to ask. Compost toilets. Early in the logistical discussions with the Lake Worth kids, the issue of facilities arose. Even if we found a porta-potty company willing to deliver in the middle of a hostile land takeover, we were by no means assured that we could pay for the toilet, or that we wanted a chemical-based unit given the environmental commitment of the kids. The solution? Compost toilets. On the outside, compost toilets look like regular porta-potties, although they do not have to, any constructed box could do, but the guts, or the disposal system, was different. In the traditional porta-potty, the disposal system basically consists of a large container filled with chemicals which break down excrement and odors. A truck shows up on occasion to suck out the contents of the container and replenish the chemicals, which are strong but destructive to the environment, particularly when spillage occurs. Compost toilets, on the other hand, are buckets or other containers and composting materials, such as sawdust or even dirt. After using the facilities, one simply scoops the compost materials and covers the human waste. The containers are then emptied into a large compost bin on a regular basis. After a year or so of airing out, the contents of the bin can be used as fertilizer. The process is natural, renewable, environmentally sound, and economically feasible. 2 days before the takeover, we liberated a porta-potty shell. It wasn't in use and just filthy inside. The kids cleaned it like new and removed the chemical container, as well as the vent from the back, facilitating the insert and exit of the bucket. After no arrests were made on October 23rd, we delivered the shell and demonstrated proper compost toilet usage and maintenance to the residents and volunteers. Most understood and adhered to the rules, but some simply did not get it, and others somehow made it to the toilet before we made it to them. Compost duty, Rotating and cleaning full buckets with empty ones was not the most pleasant task on the land, but probably the most important. Once we reached about 30 residents, which only took a month, one toilet wasn't enough, and the thought of more than one compost toilet was unbearable for most, including the neighbors who were forced to endure some unusual odors when inadequate amounts of coverings were used. Eventually we broke down and ordered one, and then a second, traditional porta potty. However, the lessons of composting will stick with many of us. Construction and patriarchy. The Umoja construction crew was led by Rebecca, an anarchist living in Miami. She is extremely handy and talented at construction and transferring knowledge to others, which was one of her charges. With Rebecca in charge of construction, the nature of patriarchy was laid bare for all to see, at least for all who cared to notice. For the record, I know very little about constructing and building, and during the entire life of the village, I barely constructed anything at all, even though I sought to understand what was going on for my own body of knowledge. However, time and again, men and women, but mainly men, assumed that I was in charge of construction, even as I was never caught with a hammer. They asked me how the shanties were constructed, and I would introduce them to Rebecca, our lead construction person, and she would explain the idea and process. On multiple occasions, men would look away from Rebecca, who did all the talking, to look me in the eye and ask me a question about what Rebecca was saying. She would then answer the question, and they would again look at me to ask the follow-up question. It was shocking. As we expanded construction, my opinion was often sought, and I weighed in on non-technical issues, such as where the next shanty should sit, which direction it should face, or what's the best paint color. Much of the time, I deferred to Rebecca, who was in charge of construction. Did I mention that Rebecca, not me, was in charge of construction? Still, most men wanted to hear the instructions from me, not from her. Comment. Very clear, many men have problems taking information or orders or whatever from women. Continuing. The patriarchal domain men exercised over the area of construction was even more perplexing given the fact that most of the construction, at least in the first few weeks, was not only led but implemented by women. Lynn, Cara, a Lake Worth, Florida commissioner, Monique and Madeline, Pancho, Amanda, and so many others were hard at work building shanties, while so many men sat around talking about the hard work involved in building the shanties. One bright spot was one of our early volunteers, Leon Thomas. I met Thomas years prior, after his brother, Duke Daly, was shot and killed by North Miami police on Father's Day 2001. Duke was wheelchair-bound and shot 4 times, in the back, as he rolled away from a cop who told him to stop. When he heard about Umoja, Thomas, who's in the construction business, offered his expertise. In spite of his expertise and considerable work experience, Thomas accepted Rebecca's leadership, making suggestions where he could, while asking permission and opinions on everything from design to bracing and everything else. Rebecca and the Lake Worth kids did an amazing job of planning and building, a task which was daunting enough without the constant pull of patriarchy. Pallet palaces. The shanties in which people lived were nicknamed the pallet palaces. They were constructed of wooden pallets, those used by businesses to store and move inventory. Forklifts are used to lift pallets off the ground or from shelves, and businesses regularly throw them out after shipments and stocking. As such, the kids scavenged for pallets all over town, picking up small quantities of pallets near business trash bins. We realized very quickly, however, that our needs were significantly outstripping the supply, and we eventually purchased the pallets for $2 apiece. Each shanty required 20 pallets in all, plus 2 pieces of 8x10 plywood, some tarp, cardboard, and nails. The structures are remarkably simple to build, sturdy, and efficient. The palace backs consist of 2 vertical rows of 3 pallets, forming a wall approximately 6 feet 5 inches high and 12 feet wide. Each side consists of 2 rows of 2 pallets, creating a depth of about 8 feet. An additional 2x2 pallet wall was installed in the center of each unit, converting each structure into a duplex. 2 more pallets were stacked at the entrance, attached to the center wall as a frame for the door. Each unit then was 8 feet deep and about 6 feet wide. The walls are nailed together and braced at all significant joints and even some less significant ones. The roofs required a bit of a rise or pitch so as to run off rainwater. The 2 plywood sheets are secured on the top at a pitch, and covered with a large tarp. The walls are covered with flattened cardboard boxes, which are then painted over with acrylic paint, which, it turns out, is waterproof. Anything from a blanket to a fully functional door serve the needs of privacy and security. The duplex design not only maximized pallet usage, but it also built in accountability among neighbors, as the actions of one directly impacted the quality of life of the other. Showers and gardens. We needed a shower, and again, Rebecca figured that whole thing out. We found some tiles and laid them on a modest dirt-based elevation to serve as the shower floor. The walls were constructed of pallets. A traditional shower curtain served as the door, and a tin sheet worked as the roof. A 5-gallon bucket, painted black to attract the sun, was elevated and placed towards the rear of the shower. A pipe and valve was installed at the bottom of the bucket. Outside of the shower, a rudimentary ladder was placed to enable the shower taker to climb and pour water into the top of the elevated bucket. After allowing the water to warm up a bit in the sun, one enters the shower and opens the valve, enabling gravity to work its magic. The cracks between the tiles on the floor were utilitarian. 2 pipes were placed under the elevated tiles, capturing the runoff water, delivering it to the adjacent garden bed. Every shower not only cleaned a resident, but helped to grow collard greens and other vegetables. Naming Umoja. Less than a week after the takeover, I sat for a rare spell at home, scribbling furiously in my notebook, brainstorming. Bernadette inquired, so I told her about the half-dozen or so things I was working on, including coming up with proposed names for the village. She listened to my list of names, which I worked on since before the takeover, and was thoroughly unimpressed. Why don't you name it Umoja for unity? I literally rolled my eyes and audibly scoffed. It's Swahili, another language. People are not going to be into it. Forget it. I wanted to nip her sudden helpfulness in the bud because she tends to jump in during the middle of a project, making suggestions with a smug attitude of righteousness. It didn't work. Why not? The residents are all about the unity. You're a Pan-African. It makes total sense. Try it. People will be into it. I tried for several minutes to convince her that I already knew the residents, their collective likes, dislikes, and tastes, and that they would not like Umoja for unity, but she persisted until I agreed to include the word on the list of proposed names in exchange for some peace and quiet. A few days later, several residents talked on the living room couches, and I brought up the subject. Everyone was excited about naming the Shantytown, and we jumped right into the list of a dozen or so suggestions. The list was quickly narrowed in half and then down to the final 4. I scanned the list and Umoja was on it. At this point, the concept of promoting self-determination didn't seem nearly as important as avoiding a lifetime of Bernadette holding this victory, if we can call it that, over my head. That shirt does look great on you. Remember how right I was about Umoja? My heartbeat quickened, and I contemplated the ethics of unduly influencing the resident process of naming the Shantytown. When the list was down to the final 2, I knew I was cooked. By the time the group selected Umoja Village for real, I was already thinking of ways to avoid the conversation with her altogether. I wondered what the chances were that she forgot about the naming ceremony taking place later that same week. When I got home, I was unusually quiet. "How's the village?" she asked, as usual. "Fine, same thing. We're building. A few new residents. Mostly uneventful. How about your day?" I ventured, hoping to change the subject. "Okay, so what did they decide?" Who?" "You know, the residents. For the naming ceremony this week. What's the name of the Shantytown?" "Oh, it's not important. It's a Shantytown. We can just call it the Shantytown." She saddled up to me, grinning from ear to ear, deliberately, and oh so cruelly, placing both arms around me. "So," she said, leaning in close to my face. I was right. Self-determination. A core component of our model involved the self-determination of the black community in general and the residents in particular. The residents, therefore, not only ran their affairs in relation to the broader powers that be, but also ran their affairs in relation to us, the organizers. This concept was made real in many forms. For example, the Lake Worth kids and others were required not only to build the initial units of housing, but also to train the residents on how to build the units themselves, ultimately making the residents self-reliant in matters of building and repair. At some point, the organizers would, as a general rule, not pick up trash on the land, as the residents were to exercise both rights and responsibilities on their land. While I was most closely associated with Umoja, Pancho took the ultimate step and essentially moved into the village herself. She lived in a shanty, organized volunteers, and dealt with ongoing issues 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Part of her job was to pass on her skill set and experience to the residents so that they could run the village themselves, a plan which met with success. The primary means of exercising self-determination, however, took the form of Sunday meetings. Each and every Sunday at 5 p.m., we met in the living room to discuss all matters Umoja, large and small. We talked about supplies, use of the kitchen, late-night security detail, arguments on the land, trash cleanup, the latest threats on Umoja, and everything in between. During Sunday meetings, residents aired grievances and looked to resolve conflicts. When two residents argued bitterly during the week, instead of taking it off the land, they took it to Sunday meeting. We listened to both sides and suggested, even mandated, potential remedies to each situation. Residents voted to stop or resume building units, the rules of the land, who had to leave, and who was moving in. There were a number of occasions during which residents were asked to leave, either for a few days or for good. A few were voted off for multiple violations of taking food from the kitchen, but most were voted off for being a consistent nuisance and breaking the peace. Particularly in the beginning, most of those removed were assumed to have been sent by someone intent upon triggering behavior to justify a raid on the land. The debate was always passionate, and it was every resident's responsibility to enforce decisions made. It was empowering to witness poor black people respect each other and themselves enough to make and enforce their own rules, rather than asking the state to intervene. The process proved we were fully capable of handling our own affairs without the intervention of the police. The difficulty lied in determining the points at which the organizers should lead, intervene, or just facilitate the discussion and decision-making. At times, we intervened too much, robbing the residents of their right to make their own decisions, including their own mistakes. And at times, we erred on the opposite end of the spectrum, failing to provide the required amount of political leadership. At some point, the residents began to assert their right to even greater autonomy in their decision-making. The sentiment arose after one or more of the organizers second-guessed resident decisions, and informally worked towards a reconsideration. This happened mainly after a resident was suspended or expelled from the land, and one of the organizers felt sorry for the newly departed. Such interventions, however, created a dynamic in which an offender essentially had two chances at redemption, first by pleading their case to the residents during Sunday meeting, and then by appealing to the organizers. While the organizers acted in compassion, the end result undermined the self-determination of the residents. As such, the residents asserted their right to self-determination. It was a terribly exciting time, watching residents graduate from no power at all to a recognition that significant power is not enough. The road ahead was not easy, as residents learned how to wield power. Sometimes they didn't use it often or quickly enough, while other times they were too swift and too harsh in meting out justice. Come to think of it, those are some of the same mistakes made by all others in power. Liberation is not a destination, it is a journey.